Eindhoven still single? Wow. Christmas must feel really lonely for you, my sister said loudly, lifting her wine glass, just enough to make sure every conversation at the table stopped. The laughter came exactly as she expected. It echoed across my parents' dining room, bounced off the glowing Christmas tree, and mixed with the soft music playing in the background. Even my cousins, who avoided eye contact moments earlier, suddenly found their plates fascinating while they laughed anyway. Mom forced an awkward smile. "She's only teasing," she whispered, as if humiliation became harmless when wrapped in holiday cheer. I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt, because I had spent years learning that the quietest people survive the longest. I carefully set my untouched drink onto the polished oak table. The tiny sound of the glass meeting, the wood somehow cut through the laughter better than shouting ever could. "Don't worry about me," I said, my voice calm enough to make everyone lean in. "I'm doing just fine." The room settled. "I've actually been married for years." Silence. Mom froze with her glass halfway to her lips. My father's fork stopped in midair. My sister blinked once, then laughed nervously, convinced I was trying to save face. "Married?" she asked. Her smile weakened. "To who?" For the first time that evening, every pair of eyes rested on me instead of judging me. No one noticed the small gold band hidden beneath the sleeve of my sweater. No one had ever asked why I never defended myself. They had been so busy writing the story of my lonely life that they never realized I'd spent years quietly writing a different ending. And Christmas was finally the night they were going to read it. I'm the oldest of three, but somehow I was always treated like the unfinished draft of the family. My younger sister Claire was the one everyone celebrated. She was louder, prettier, quicker with a joke, and she knew exactly how to keep the spotlight on herself. I was the dependable one, the daughter who remembered birthdays, drove mom to appointments, fixed problems without being asked, and quietly disappeared once everything was running smoothly. After Dad's business failed when I was in my 20s, I put my own plans on hold to help keep the family afloat. I worked long hours, paid bills no one ever thanked me for, and became the person everyone called when life went wrong. Somehow, the more reliable I became, the less visible I seemed. When I stopped bringing dates to family gatherings, they filled the silence with their own conclusions. To them, a woman without a husband was a woman who had somehow failed. Every birthday after 30 came with another joke, another forced introduction to someone's nephew, another reminder that my life supposedly hadn't started yet. I stopped correcting them. People reveal more about themselves when they think you've already lost. They never asked why I declined invitations or disappeared for weeks at a time. They never wondered why I never posted my personal life online while everyone else documented every anniversary and vacation. Curiosity would have required seeing me as someone with a story instead of a punchline. That was the strange thing about my family. They mistook privacy for emptiness. I let them. Because the truth wasn't something I needed to defend. It was something I intended to reveal only when it could no longer be dismissed, interrupted, or laughed away. Years of being underestimated had taught me a simple lesson. The strongest move isn't proving people wrong the moment they doubt you. It's allowing their certainty to grow so complete that, when the truth finally arrives, it collapses everything they thought they knew. Every family gathering followed the same script, only the decorations changed. At Easter, Claire would introduce me as her mysterious older sister, then add, with a playful shrug, "She works too much to date anyone." Everyone laughed as though she'd invented the joke that afternoon instead of polishing it for years. At my cousin's wedding, she slipped the photographer a smile and whispered loudly enough for me to hear, "Just don't put her next to the bouquet. We don't need desperate energy in the pictures." The photographer hesitated. Then he quietly moved me to the edge of the family portrait. No one objected. Mom always found a softer way to agree. She never insulted me directly. Instead, she'd squeeze my hand afterward and murmur, "Your sister doesn't think before she speaks." But she never asked Claire to apologize. Dad was worse in his own quiet way. Whenever someone asked about my life, he'd answer for me before I had the chance. "She keeps busy with work," he'd say, already changing the subject. As if that explained everything worth knowing. I noticed the small things most people missed, the sideways glances when engagement. Rings were admired around the table, the awkward pauses whenever conversations turned to anniversaries or children, the sympathetic smiles that lingered just a second too long before drifting away. It wasn't cruelty born from hatred. It was something colder. They had reduced me to a conclusion. The unmarried daughter. The reliable daughter. The one who would always come home alone. What none of them realized was that I had stopped defending myself years earlier, because every correction became another family debate. They didn't want answers. They wanted certainty. And certainty was easier when I stayed silent. So I let them mistake silence for surrender. While they kept collecting assumptions, I kept collecting patience. By the time Christmas arrived that year, they believed they knew every chapter of my life. The only thing they had never considered was that I had intentionally hidden the final one. The turning point didn't happen because of one cruel joke. It happened because I looked around that Christmas table and realized no one expected me to answer anymore. They expected me to smile, to lower my eyes, to let Claire win another round without resistance. As the laughter faded, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. My nephew, barely 12 years old, was watching me instead of his mother. He wasn't laughing. He was learning that the quiet person at the table was the safest target, and that humiliation became acceptable if enough people smiled while it happened. That thought unsettled me more than Claire's words ever could. I hadn't stayed silent to protect myself. I had stayed silent to protect the peace. But peace that depends on one person accepting disrespect isn't peace at all. I rested my fingertips against the cool glass beside my plate and made a decision that felt strangely calm. I wasn't going to expose anyone, raise my voice, or settle old scores with anger. I was simply going to stop helping them believe a lie. "Don't worry about me," I said, meeting Claire's eyes for the first time all evening. "I'm doing just fine." Then I added the single sentence that changed the atmosphere in an instant. "I've actually been married for years." The room seemed to lose its sound. Claire's confident smile faltered before disappearing completely. Dad slowly lowered his fork onto his plate. Mom stared at me as though she were searching my face for the punchline that never came. "For years?" Claire asked quietly. "To who?" For the first time in my life, no one interrupted me. No one laughed. The certainty they had built over years of assumptions had collapsed in a matter of seconds. And in that silence, I finally understood something. The most powerful revenge wasn't proving them wrong. It was allowing them to realize they had never truly known me at all. No one spoke for several seconds after I said the words. They waited for me to laugh, to admit it was sarcasm, to rescue them from the discomfort settling over the room. I didn't. Instead, I reached into my handbag and placed a slim leather card holder beside my plate. "I never hid it," I said quietly. "I just stopped volunteering information to people who had already decided they knew my life." Inside was a certified copy of my marriage certificate. Nothing dramatic, just a document with 2 names, a date from 6 years earlier, and the official seal that left very little room for debate. Claire stared at it but didn't touch it. Dad adjusted his glasses before reading it twice. Mom's face drained of color. The truth was far less sensational than they had imagined. My husband, Daniel, was a wildlife photographer whose assignments kept him overseas for months at a time. We had agreed early in our marriage to keep our private life off social media after strangers began reposting his work alongside details about our home and routines. Privacy wasn't secrecy, it was a boundary. Only our closest friends knew. Our employers knew. Our attorney knew because he'd prepared our wills and property documents. Our accountant knew because every tax return had been filed jointly and correctly for years. The people who didn't know were the ones who had never bothered to ask. That was never an accident. I had answered every intrusive question with polite silence, watching to see whether anyone cared enough to replace assumptions with curiosity. No one ever did. So I never corrected them. I didn't spend years constructing a revenge. I simply allowed their own confidence to become the evidence against them. By the time they realized how little they knew about my life, I didn't have to argue a single point. The facts spoke more clearly than I ever could. No one reached for dessert. The candles continued to flicker in the center of the table, but the warmth they had given the room seemed to disappear. Even the Christmas music felt distant, swallowed by the silence my family had spent years teaching me to accept. Claire finally cleared her throat. "So, you just never told us?" There was no anger in her voice anymore. Only confusion. "I tried," I answered. "The first few times I was interrupted. After that, no one asked questions, they made conclusions. No one argued, because they all knew it was true." I looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes without bitterness. Every holiday became a conversation about what I was missing. "Not one of you ever wondered whether you were missing part of my life?" Mom slowly lowered her gaze. Dad rubbed the bridge of his nose, a habit he had whenever he realized he had been wrong. Claire looked smaller somehow. For years, she had built her confidence by standing on a version of me that existed only in her imagination. Now that version had vanished, and there was nowhere left for her jokes to land. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "You do," I replied. Then I let the silence finish the sentence for her. There was nothing else to prove. No speeches, no accusations, no victory lap. The room itself became the consequence. For the rest of the evening, every casual comment was measured before it was spoken. Every glance carried the weight of embarrassment. They weren't afraid of my secret anymore. They were confronting the uncomfortable truth that they had never really known, their own daughter, their own sister. As I put on my coat to leave, Mom whispered, "Will you bring Daniel next Christmas?" I smiled, not out of triumph, but because the question arrived years too late. "We'll see," I said gently. For the first time in my life, they understood that an invitation had to be earned. And I walked into the cold, Christmas night with something far more satisfying than revenge. I walked away with my dignity intact and left them alone with the echo of everything they had failed to see. The weeks after Christmas were quieter than I expected. Not because my family was angry, because they no longer knew how to speak to me. Claire stopped sending sarcastic memes about dating. The teasing disappeared overnight, replaced by brief, carefully worded messages that sounded as though she was learning a language she'd never needed before: respect. Mom called more often, but for the first time, she asked questions instead of offering excuses. "How's Daniel? When will he be home? What have the two of you been working on?" Simple questions. The kind families are supposed to ask. Dad apologized in the only way he knew how. He never gave emotional speeches. Instead, he mailed me an old photo album he had restored, along with a handwritten note. "I'm sorry. I stopped seeing the woman you became because I kept looking at the girl I thought I knew." I read that sentence more than once. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. The biggest change, however, happened inside me. I no longer felt responsible for managing everyone else's comfort. I realized how much energy I'd spent making myself smaller, so other people wouldn't feel awkward about the life they imagined I had. Once I stopped carrying that burden, conversations became lighter, boundaries became easier, and silence no longer felt like surrender. Some relationships recovered. Others never returned to what they had been. And that was all right. Trust doesn't break in one dramatic moment. It wears away through hundreds of small assumptions, careless jokes, and missed opportunities to truly listen. Rebuilding it takes far more than a single apology. If there's anything worth remembering from my story, it's this. People rarely reveal their character during your successes. They reveal it in the stories they invent about you when they think you have nothing to offer. Those stories can shape how they treat you for years, unless you decide, quietly and confidently, to stop living inside the version of yourself they've created. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't exposing someone else's cruelty. It's refusing to let their misunderstanding become your identity. The months that followed taught me something I had never understood while I was busy defending myself. Respect given after a shocking revelation isn't nearly as valuable as the peace that comes from no longer needing anyone's approval. Daniel eventually came home between assignments, and the next family dinner was nothing like the ones before. Claire was polite, almost painfully so. She laughed less and listened more. Mom stopped trying to explain everyone's behavior and simply accepted responsibility for her own. Dad asked Daniel about his travels, but every so often his eyes drifted toward me, as if he were quietly mourning the years he had spent knowing only the version of his daughter he had imagined. Forgiveness didn't arrive all at once. Neither did trust. We rebuilt both slowly, one honest conversation at a time, and I learned that healthy boundaries don't punish people. They simply reveal who is willing to respect them. For the first time in years, I felt no need to prove that my life was meaningful. I stopped measuring my happiness against anyone else's expectations. My marriage remained private, not because I feared judgment anymore, but because some of life's greatest treasures become stronger when they aren't displayed for applause. Looking back, I realized Claire hadn't stolen my confidence. I had handed it to her every time I believed I needed to answer her opinions. The night I chose silence backed by truth instead of silence born from fear, everything changed. Not because my family suddenly became perfect, because I finally became free. People often believe revenge is watching someone suffer. I discovered something far more satisfying. Real revenge is living so completely in your own truth that the people who underestimated you are forced to confront the limits of their own assumptions. And if they never change, you still win. Because the happiest life is the one that no longer needs permission to exist.